Yeah, I told you that I love you, but look at you change, babe. I know I said I need you, I know I said I need you.
Geology. Welcome everybody to the Mini Geology radio show. This is Daniel Minizini, your inquisitive geologist, KPFT HD2 channel. Welcome everybody in Houston, Texas, and the world, as well as the International Space Station and those astronauts that they could be listening to us thanks to the brotherhood we have with NASA here in Houston. And as you know, we connect every day geology, our beloved discipline, with society at large. Well, today we have with us Adam Bobbette. Adam is a geographer trained in philosophy and cultural studies. He's a postdoctoral research fellow at the University of New South Wales in Australia. So we go to the other part of the world, Southern Hemisphere, with Adam that is investigating the intersections of people with environment and those intersections of nature with culture. Welcome to the Mini Geology show. He's now in Sydney. Hello, Adam. Are you with us?
I'm with you, yes. Hello.
Thank you very much, Adam, to be with us, being early there on the other side of the world. We know you are a passionate of the political geology, and this is another facet of our beloved science that I would like to investigate with you, because I read something about your writings, and I grasped that political geology shapes the future of the Earth, and not vice versa. So I would like to have this intriguing conversation with you. Political geology seems to have emerged from the recent interest in what we call the Anthropocene. In fact, there is a growing recognition that humankind is a geological force. We are a geological factor. So political geology seeks to understand how geology has been implicated in politics and by politics. So I won't go beyond this a couple of statements, and I will leave Adam to talk about this. Adam, what is political geology for you?
I guess the place to start is to distinguish it from geopolitics. Geopolitics is an old and very well-known discipline, and geographers spend a lot of time thinking about geopolitics and doing geopolitics. When a friend of mine and I began to think about political geology, to shift the term a little bit, it was because we thought that the tradition of geopolitics didn't have very much geology in it, and maybe it didn't have very much of the geos in general. Didn't seem like there was very much earth in geopolitics. The kind of conventional perspective on geopolitics is, a bunch of states sitting on the Earth's surface, interacting with each other, and that in the process of state interaction, there's not much space for the Earth and its processes. Now, there's one, it's kind of an inaccurate understanding of the history of geopolitics, because if you go back to 19th century, especially German geopolitical tradition, or the tradition of writing about geopolitics, there is a decent amount of room that's given to natural processes and earth processes in the creation of politics. But it felt to us as if that had been largely forgotten in the present. So really, the purpose of political geology was to begin to think about the role of geology in shaping global politics. And that ended up, opening up into a whole bunch of different directions.
So, Adam, do you mean that you coined the terms political geology, or it already existed?
So it had been used previously, as far as I know, a few times. There was a seminar that was held about a year and a half, 2 years before we held one, and then there's a kind of scattered use of it. So what we tried to do is kind of consolidate it and to give it a kind of robust literature and robust definition.
I'm interested in this in introducing a new slice of geology with a different slant. How difficult was to allow our community to lean on this new subdiscipline, political geology? How did you convince the community that this was the right thing to do, instead of just talking with the community of geopolitics or geopoliticians, saying you would need to introduce more geology and geophysics into your studies?
Yeah. Well, there's no agreement, and there wasn't much talking with the community that happened beforehand. We just kind of did it. And I don't come out of the tradition of geopolitics either, within geography specifically. I'm something of an outsider in that way.
What about the difference between the politics of geology and the geology of politics? Is there difference in these two concepts?
Yeah. Yeah. So I would understand it to be there's a difference, first of all, between geological matter and its processes and its force, its agency in the world. So the way in which geology shapes spaces, the way in which it's used, the way in which it's mined, the way in which it's interacted with. And then there is the knowledge of geology, or the epistemology of geology, the way that people think about geology, the way that people understand geology. And those has its own particular kinds of dynamics. So whether we think about the extractive industries and the tradition of thinking about geology as a resource, or if we think about the way in which, for animists in the Malay world, geology is a home for ancestor spirits, then these two very different ways of conceiving of geology lead to very different kinds of social responses. If you understand that geology is a resource, then you can mine it. If you understand that it's where, dead people live, then it's more difficult to mine.
Adam, so you are building up a community around this politics of geology. Where are the centers of excellence? Where are the institutions that they do the research on the political geology?
Well, there are a few. It's mainly about mapping individuals' work and where those individuals are. So there are no centers as of yet. I don't know that there ever will be. There could be. But yeah, I mean, there were quite a few of us at Cambridge who were thinking about these things. Most of the people that I work with in the British UK context. Yeah, I mean, and then I am currently based at in the New Earth Histories program at the University of New South Wales. So, and there are friends at Oxford working on similar things too. So, yeah, you know, all over the place.
Is it still a Anglo-centric perspective, as many of the disciplines of geology, or are other parts of the world, Western world and non-Western world, involved in the political geology?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Not enough yet. It's just still really Western.
Why?
Yeah. Why? Well, it has to do with institutional politics. It has to do with the kind of fashions that drive the academy and why certain things become interesting at particular moments and not others, such as why the Anthropocene is particularly fashionable right now, whereas in other parts of the world, the Anthropocene is no big surprise whatsoever. Yeah. So it has to do with the reach of scholarly literature and how it circulates. Yeah.
So do you envision a community of political geology more cosmopolitan, or you already see that the horizon is going to remain within the Western world?
Well, one of my core interests is in the way in which the history of geological thought and geological ideas, and ideas about what the Earth is made of, are not only a property of the Western world and the Northern world. So I think about the history of geological ideas and ideas of what the Earth is made of in a much broader cosmopolitan way. So I am really interested in like Javanese conceptions of geology and traditions of geology. I do a lot of my work in Indonesia, so I spend a lot of time thinking about and studying Hindu and Buddhist conceptions of what the Earth is made of and what geological materials are. So I think that it's really, really important to expand our understanding of geology, the tradition of geology, beyond the West and beyond the North. Absolutely.
What are the main different mindsets of the geologists that they operate, or the people that they live in areas that they are geologically active, when you compare them with the Western world?
Yeah. Well, one of the main differences is animism, of course. So if you understand that rocks are alive, that's a big difference from the modern Western tradition, which tends to understand rocks as kind of materials that are sitting there waiting for us to use them, even if they have a history and that history is long and deep and made up of processes. Those processes are often considered to be extrinsic to the material itself.
Can you give us some examples that maybe happened to you over there?
Yeah, so I did my PhD field work, and I continue to work on a volcano called Mount Merapi, which is in the center of Java. And I spent a year circulating between the state scientific observatory at the bottom of the volcano and communities at the top of the volcano, villages at the top. And my friends in the village understand that if you die, your soul goes into the volcano. So this is a totally different way of thinking about what a volcano is, right? Because a volcano is actually full of dead people. And so at night and at other auspicious times during the year, souls can leave the volcano and come down into the forest or come down into the village. And one of the ways that people communicate with the volcano is through possession ceremonies. So this would be kind of like people speaking in tongues in Texas, in megachurches in Texas. Basically what happens is that in these villages, people have a party and they dance really hard, and then they get possessed by spirits. And the spirits speak through them and tell them what's going to happen with the volcano, if it's going to erupt, etc. So that was a really, really incredible way of thinking about geology and the Earth itself.
But the institutions or the governments, the states, do they use this mindset based on animism, or they refuse that when they have to act and take decisions?
Right. Yeah, so that's really interesting. This is exactly where the politics of geology gets really interesting, because it depends. It depends. So in the observatory at the base of the volcano, you have some tension over the metaphysical, religious dimension of the volcano. In the observatory, I mean, it's an observatory that would be very recognizable to any of us. It's, full of seismographs and tilt meters and really sophisticated instrumentation, with very sophisticated scientists who work there, who have, for the most part, all been trained in a European context. They have PhDs in seismology, etc. But then also within the observatory there are musholla, like little mosques, right? And without a doubt, people pray 3 times during the workday. And a lot of scientists will say to me, they did say to me that it's Allah who governs when the volcano is actually going to erupt. The best that they can do is use the most modern contemporary instrumentation to try to read what they can. But at the same time, there's a history of animist ideas being taken up by very prominent people in positions of political power. So Suharto, who's the dictator in Indonesia for forever, throughout the 1960s, 70s, and 80s. Sorry, 1970s, 80s, and 90s. It was very well known that he provided offerings to various volcanoes, and he was a highly mystical army general who believed deeply in the old Javanese animist ideas. But at the same time, he was absolutely committed to modernization. to technological forms of modernization that would bring Indonesia into the first world. So it's amazing because you have this guy who is essentially like, let's join the West, but at the same time we will remain strident animists who believe that, who understand that volcanoes are full of spirits.
Adam, if we move now to the Western world, how the geological sciences contribute to the varied forms of what the philosopher Michel Foucault calls governmentality. So, how the geological sciences contribute to governmentality? How does the geology affect the political arena?
Yeah. Well, in so many ways, it's like if you understand that our obsession with growth is, and that our conception of society as being a growth-dependent, growth-driven society, which has largely ruled our conception of society since the Second World War. How do you achieve growth? You achieve it through resources. And how do you understand where resources are, or even what a resource is? Well, you need sciences like geology that go out and map and detail and explain what a resource it is.
But isn't it this like a typical topic of the geopolitics? The geopolitics that try to understand the connection between natural resources and technology, for instance, in order to be a protagonist and a player in the world, something that Russia and China, as well as United States, they are always doing. What is new in the political geology? What is new in your point of view? Or the novelty is just shifting from more strategical studies or strategical analysis of the different states that they populate the world, moving more into the scientific theories or analysis of data related to the discipline?
Yeah, totally. So what is new about political geology is, well, there's really two things. So as you said, so we know really well that geopolitics is very good at studying how it is that resources are made and managed and distributed. One of the important things, one of the new things about political geology is that in conventional geopolitical conceptions of resources are kind of dumb and stupid, and they sit there and wait for us to use them, to mobilize them. There's a conception of matter, really of geological matter, as essentially stable. Political geology is rather interested in geological matter that is unstable. So we look a lot at volcanoes, earthquakes, landslides, and kind of volatile geologies.
So how these topics that you just enumerate, they affect the politics?
Yeah, well, they affect politics in a really crucial way, because you can't. But so if we consider volcanoes, volcanoes are entities that we can't really predict. The kind of knowledge that we can have of a volcano is highly uncertain. And so the kind of politics that emerges from trying to manage a volcano has to negotiate high levels of uncertainty, high levels of distrust, populations that need to be engaged with in an unconventional way because they're not dealing with certainty. So it's a different kind of political field, just as it's a different kind of material field. Do you see what I mean?
Yes. Yes, I see that. And actually, I'm wondering if this is a good moment to talk about the futures that geology can present to the politicians, or vice versa, what are the futures that politicians they want to present to society thanks to the study of geology. Because every day we hear some claim about the future of nature, what it will do, where its consequences will be felt, and by whom. So I would like you to talk about the process of forecasting and how futures emerge and also pass away.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So maybe we could come back to the volcano. Because essentially for me, the volcano is a way to think about the rest of society today. So with volcano forecasting, so the volcano that I'm thinking of, Mount Merapi, has like anywhere between 1 and 2 million people that are living on it, and it sometimes erupts massively. In 2010, there was an eruption that caused the evacuation of 400,000 people, roughly, over a period of 3 months, and went into refugee camps and such. So massive disruption. And the entire problem with Mount Merapi is how you forecast when it's going to erupt next, and how you forecast with precision when an eruption is going to happen. Because if you are imprecise, then you lose the trust of the people who live there. So if you tell everybody to leave and nothing happens, it doesn't erupt, then people won't believe you the next time that you tell them to leave. So there's a very fragile calculus that has to happen between the forecaster and the population. So in this way, forecasting is something which opens up future possibilities that have consequences, very material, direct consequences on how it is that people can be, how it is that people can act in the present. Now, another thing about why I think it's important to think about forecasting and how futures are created is because it's really simple. It's a really simple thing to say, but I think the consequences are really actually complicated to try to think through, which is that futures are not equal throughout society, right? We don't all have the same we don't all have the same futures. And we don't think about the future in the same way. So this is futures are very socially constituted depending on where we are at our intersections of class, race, gender, life histories, and geographies. So, yeah, there's a way in which I'm trying to think through. I don't know. This isn't totally fully developed yet, but I'm trying to think through the kind of variations on futures and the ways in which futures become imagined and lived differently.
So, in your explanation implies that there is never just one future on the social scenes, but a plethora of them, that they are coming into being and passing away depending on the contingency, mainly the political reasoning around what is the story that it wants to talk about the future. So Is it true that the politicization of the futures are used to govern people in space? And do you know
absolutely.
some examples beyond the ones that you gave us about the volcano?
Right. Yeah. Yeah. So yeah, of course. So that's a more familiar kind of understanding, right? It's the way in which futures are used to govern people in the present. So to give you an example, Mount Pektu, also another volcano that sits at the border between North Korea and China. And the border between the two states actually runs directly through the caldera, so that on the eastern side of the volcano is North Korea and the western side is mainland China. So if the volcano is going to erupt, the two states, because they don't speak with each other, they will bring two separate teams of scientists, sort of approaching the volcano from either side. And because of the disparity between scientific knowledge between the two states as well, it has happened in the past that they have very different perspectives on what's going to happen inside and what is happening inside the volcano, which creates totally also disparate responses to eruption. So that's like a really great example of how you have the same entity, the same volcano, but because of the political configurations, the geological political configurations with the volcano, totally different kind of futures which are emerging.
We can see that very clearly. So forecasting on volcanoes activity, as well as rising sea level and maybe potential landslides or tsunamis, is something that we all heard about. But there's another kind of forecasting that I read you are analyzing. So forecasting the behaviors of the Earth interior rather than the surface of the Earth. So forecasting this high levels of uncertainty is a way of doing cosmology. Can you explain?
Mm. Yeah. Yeah, so basically what I mean is that I understand that geology has always been part of doing cosmology. So I don't separate geology from cosmology in the sense of I know that it's very common for geologists to work on very specialized, very narrow fields of inquiry. I know what it's like to work in a lab. I mean, not that I've done it, but that I've watched people do it. I've studied people doing it. And I spent a good amount of time with colleagues at Cambridge as they looked at mineral formations under microscopes and things like that. And that kind of work is highly, highly detailed, very specific, and it seems about as far away as possible from doing cosmology as anything could be. I just completely disagree, and I think that it's really important to remember that geological work, geological sciences, have always been a part of a project of explaining what the Earth is made of and how it sits in the universe and its cosmological position. And that kind of process is deep, it's old, it goes back to the earliest written records of what it means to be human, and that they are essentially big questions about what it means to be alive in the universe.
In other words, Adam, you say that the scientists geologists that they are investigating on the genesis of their material that they're studying, let's say rocks, they have a subconscious bias that they use in order to project their findings?
No. What I'm saying, what I'm basically trying to say is that doing geology is a way of doing philosophy. That's it. That at the core of doing geology is trying to think about and answer the question what the Earth is made of, why it is the way that it is, and why it is in the cosmos. So that is cosmology.
So cosmology is a product of the time when we live. So today is based on global networks of instruments, satellites, labs, etc. In a way, cosmology is a synonym of model, if you want. So in the past, we have different models to explain how the Earth was formed, as well as we have the different cosmologies that they fall into the myth also. So how do you detach the mythological aspect from the geological studies, or let us know if you don't detach it at all?
Yeah, so I don't at all. Not at all.
So in that sense, it wouldn't be what we describe as a science. Geology wouldn't be a science.
Yeah, right. That's if you understand that science has ever been separated from myth, which I don't think it ever did.
You are inferring also other disciplines like physics or maybe biology?
So this is I know that this is controversial, but I'm totally ready to go for it. That the conventional distinctions between science and myth and science and religion are completely fabricated and don't actually successfully describe the differences between those practices. So for me, doing geology is doing religion. It's totally a religious practice. It is a mythological practice, as well as being a scientific practice. But the things are not so easily separated or distinguished. For example, like I was saying earlier on, when I was spending time in the observatory in Yogyakarta in Indonesia, and my scientist friends go from working on instruments, reading seismographs in the morning, to morning prayer, and then back to their instruments. And it's a very fluid kind of relationship.
Where would be the bias that we, let's say in the Western world, we experience every day? Where would be the bias when we try to understand the difference, or we want to put a difference between science and myth, between science and religion? Where is that bias? Where is that thing that you see very clearly?
Well, it's part of it is this kind of heroic myth of science that definitely has its roots in post-war and Cold War American science, in which there was a fascination with accuracy and instrumentation in geology. There was a fascination with the use of big machinery, complicated devices. In part, it has to do with the culture wars throughout the 80s and 90s, in which scientists, people like Richard Dawkins, became really afraid that evangelical Christians would take over education systems. So this myth was created that strongly separates religion from science. Even though we know that since the very beginning of geology as a modern scientific discipline, it has been undertaken by priests, that there's been a conception in which doing geology has been a project of revealing the mind of God at work in matter, that the creation / discovery of geological time, of deep geological time, was a project of the Christian church itself, that it was actual priests who began to question the biblical version of Genesis. So there's never been a kind of clear distinction between religion and geology. It has always been a kind of cosmological, big question, deep philosophical endeavor that has crossed the boundaries between religion and science. Also, if I can just give one last example, if you go back and you actually read 19th century geology, if you read people like Seuss, The Face of the Earth, The Face of the Earth, if I'm not mistaken, it begins with a quotation from the Ramayana, and he refers over and over again to Hindu epic literature, Greek mythology. He names the Tethys Ocean after the goddess of one of the Greek goddesses, and it's one of the standard works of modern geology.
Adam, are you religious?
Kind of poorly religious, yeah, I guess, yeah.
Is important the position that you declare, for instance, being a scientist or being a religious person, is important to try to understand better the problem we're debating on?
Right. Yeah, so, right. Well, yeah. If I understand what you're saying, that there's a certain fear around that, there's a certain idea that, like, religious thought is a biased thought, whereas scientific thought is an unbiased thought.
And regardless the opinion that you and myself may have personally, do you think that a person with a religious thought and a person with a scientific thought would arrive to different conclusions about the relationship between science and myth, science and religion?
I should hope so. That's fine. I don't do replicable experiments. That's not the kind of work that I do.
When you talk with your colleagues, are they mainly what you would call religious or scientists? Or religious scientists?
Right. Well, first of all, I don't believe that secularism ever succeeded. And by that I mean I don't think it ever happened. So I grew up in a secular society, within a secular family, and I had understood that I was essentially an atheist and lived in a kind of atheist kind of world. And then I came to understand, actually, in fact, that the Christian narrative of the universe, of the earth in the universe, and of what it means to be a human being has entirely shaped how I understand myself and my world. That I have been shaped by, essentially, a religious story. Even though that whole time I had been understood that I, rather arrogantly, could exist without the influence of religion. So it's that kind of to be straightforward, stupidity that I get frustrated by when scientists imagine that they also are able to exist in a society, a space that is not informed by the major religious tradition. Now, I'm not saying that we have to become believers, and I'm not saying that we have to then suddenly go to church or synagogue or whatever. Rather, what I do think is really important is to understand the way in which religious thought has shaped geological thought.
Yes, and so our modern cosmology of the Earth about plate tectonics. Let's say that our modern cosmology is based on plate tectonics, which we can use also the synonym. Our modern model of Earth is plate tectonics. So that invites us to forecast, because we were talking about forecasting, the earthquakes, the volcanic eruptions, the mountain uplifts, as a means of testing the world that, as I said, is our own cosmology. So, in other words, forecasting becomes a way of testing the prediction of a cosmology. Do you understand it well? Is that what you try to do? Isn't this a circular reasoning?
Yeah, it is. It totally is. Yeah. Yeah. It is a circular reasoning because it's in a way, it's an argument that says that our models, when we're testing the world, what we're actually testing are our models of the world. And that we either confirm the model or we transform the model. Yeah.
And since we were talking about forecasts, so then different cosmologies, which they may exist at the same time, they would prepare different futures. So different futures, they forge different kinds of politics. And and then different relationships between society and nature. Can you expand on this?
Yes. Yeah. So if we go back again to my friends on the volcano, and we think about the difference between if you understand that the volcano is full of your ancestors, or if you understand that the volcano is a resource, then it totally changes the relationship that you will have to the future of the volcano and to what it does. So for example, when it erupts, people can understand that the volcano is actually responding to corruption in society. People can also understand that that an eruption is depositing a whole bunch of sand, and that sand can be mined and then sold and profited from. So these are totally different models of what a volcano is, totally different conceptions of how the volcano works and what it means when it erupts. And those create totally different ways of acting and planning for the future and what to do in the case of an eruption.
I see. And I introduce the political geology as becoming a new discipline thanks to the topic of Anthropocene. I don't know if it is right or wrong, I let you decide that, but can you connect the Anthropocene, this new era of a few hundreds or thousand years, if you will, which is based on the action of the humankind and the geological cosmology.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, totally. Yeah. So it's the Anthropocene is obviously one of the big stories that we are telling ourselves right now. And it's actually a really excellent example of why I think we need to think more about theology and theological traditions, religious traditions. Because the Anthropocene is supposed to be a scientific geological definition of a particular moment in time. And we know that the Stratigraphy Commission is especially rigorous in how it is that they go about accepting or rejecting the division of geological time. They're the very highly regarded scientific institution. So there's this idea that the Anthropocene is this kind of scientific designation. But it's also really difficult not to see the Anthropocene as an essentially Christian, Judeo-Christian story of sinful, fallen humanity. It's a story that we know so well and that we repeat all the time, which is like human beings have made mistakes, big, big mistakes, and we are paying for it through the natural world. So I think that it's in part a religious cosmology as well.
Adam, it is fascinating, this discussion we are having. We are almost to the top of the hour. We still have some minutes. And because I know you have a lot of material, ideas, and passion on the political geology, I would like to leave you this couple of minutes as an open mic for you to shout out or to express the ideas you couldn't during these 56 minutes. And I thank you indeed. We are in conversation with Adam Bobbette, the geographer training in philosophy and cultural studies. He is now a postdoctoral research fellow at the University of New South Wales in Australia. He is in Sydney right now. And Adam investigates the intersections of people with environment or of nature with culture. So Adam, the mic is yours, and feel free to communicate with our community.
Well, I would like to thank you, first of all, for the conversation. It's great to just jump right into the depths of things when it's still 8 a.m. I don't really have anything more to say. I mean, there's too much more to say, so I won't. Except that I just want to continue the conversation. So, anybody, please feel free to reach out, because that's really what it's all about, is having conversations and sharing ideas, especially with people with different backgrounds.
Thank you, Adam. Thank you very, very much. And this was another show of Mini Geology, your weekly program where we put in connection geology with society at large. Adam, you are welcome to communicate with us as much as you can. You can use this radio as a megaphone to talk about your new projects, your new ideas, especially because they are novelty for many of us. So Again, this was Mini Geology. You can listen to this radio show on minigeology.com, which is a YouTube channel. And you listeners, you can write me at minigeology@gmail.com. You can propose topics, people. You can propose yourself. And so, Adam, if you have the community of students and professionals around you, be free to spread the word and invite them on board.
Thank you very much.
All right. Thank you, Adam. And have a good day down there.
Thank you. Take care.
It's clear that you don't feel the same no more. I won't be the one you blame no more. I must miss the dream you sold me, babe. You are not the same. You changed. I know I said